get started. Thanks for joining everyone, and welcome to our monthly webinar series for the National Park Service's Connected Conservation Initiative, which was formerly known as Scaling Up. This is Brian Fainer, and I help support the effort. Our Connected Conservation webinars focus on how NPS staff and partners can use various tools and strategies to conserve NPS resources at the landscape and seascape level. We host a webinar at least once a month, and you can find recordings of past webinars on our internal Connected Conservation Toolkit, which is accessible to DOI staff, as well as the Network for Landscape Conservation website. And we're going to enter links to both of those websites in the chat box momentarily. We will be posting this webinar following our presentation today, and throughout the presentation, feel free, of course, to plug in questions into the question box, and we'll host a Q&A session following a presentation and read those questions that are gathered in the question box. And then at that time as well, we'll open up the phone lines where you can then speak up and ask additional questions. Today's presenter is Rita Hennessy, the NPS's program lead for the National Trail System. Previous to this position, Rita served as the Assistant Superintendent for the Appalachian National Scenic Trail, as well as positions at Zion, Bryce, Rock Creek, and the National Mall. Throughout her 29-year career, Rita has focused on partnerships with agencies, volunteers, and local communities to increase the relevancy of national parks and trails and promote cooperative management of these unique resources. So again, we're delighted to have Rita. And Rita, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Brian. So just on the slide that I have here before I start talking about the collaborative landscape aspect of the National Trail System, just want to point out it's our 50th anniversary, and I'll get into a little bit more as we get into the presentation. So just wanted to start out with a little bit of a background on national trails before we get into the land protection piece of it. So this is a picture of President Johnson signing the National Trail System Act in 1968. Some of you might recognize some of the people behind him. There's Stuart Udall directly behind him with the dark hair, which is just one of our heroes of Interior and the National Park Service. National Trail System Act in 1968 was actually preceded by the Trails for America report, which talked about protection of all trails across the United States and trail systems, which really introduced the concept of trail systems and not just individual trails, and then kind of solidified the idea of creating a national trail system. And that idea actually came up much before even 1966. It started with some of the heroes of the Pacific Crest Trail and the Appalachian Trail. Those trails were started in the 1920s and 30s. And then by the time it got to the 60s and all of the development after World War II really needed protection, and they sought federal protection. So hence the National Trail System Act. So the system overall, we have 11 national scenic trails today, 19 national historic trails. 21 of those are administered by the National Park Service, 6 by the U.S. Forest Service, and 3, well, I should say 1 by BLM, 2 are jointly administered by the Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management, and those are 2 national historic trails. In addition, well, so overall, just that system of the scenic and historic trails make up more than 58,000 miles of trails in 49 states. 58,000 miles is more than the interstate highway program, and the one state that we're missing is Indiana. For whatever reason, I don't know why anybody didn't cross Indiana, especially with the historic trails. We also have 1,300 national recreation trails. The difference from the national scenic and historic trails and the recreation trails, scenic and historic are legislated, and the national recreation trails are designated by the secretaries. The legislative ones are amendments to the National Trail System Act, unlike the Organic Act that set up the National Park System, and then the individual parks have their own legislation. With the National Trail System Act, it's amended every time. So every time there's a feasibility study for a new trail to be studied, when it's actually legislatively designated, when there's anything in the aspects of management of the trails that's going to be amended, all of that is within the National Trail System Act. So it's a complicated, lengthy act, and we'll get into some of the aspects of that. But just to point out, national recreation trails, because it's just a designation, it was more of a opportunity for local communities to be part of the national trail system rather than just through these federal agencies. National recreation trails can exist on public lands, but they can also exist in the middle of an urban park in New York City. And it's something that's signed by the Secretary of Interior for all the agencies that are under there, or by the regional foresters in the U.S. Forest Service. And they also get a sign to put signage up that they're a national recreation trail. They have no regulations, no authorities under the federal agencies. So here's a map of the National Trail System, and this is a special map. Some of you may have seen the mapping guide that we have, which is like the Unigrid brochures that we have for the different parks. There's a brochure and map of the National Trail System. This one was adapted specifically for this year for our 50th anniversary, and Matt Robinson, just a GIS guru with the Appalachian National Scenic Trail, took this and added some artistic aspects to it, and all of the logos of the national trails, and Find Your Trail, which is one of the slogans for the 50th anniversary. So to get into some of the aspects of management, I just wish to God somebody could find this map. Nobody knows where it ended up, but after the signing of the National Trail System Act, there's Stuart Udall again and President Johnson looking at the map and identifying where the trails were. This is in 1968. In 78, the legislation was amended, which then added the National Historic Trails. And the 78 amendments also added much broader authority for land acquisition. So to get into that, a lot of people, when they see this, especially the National Historic Trails, some of them are viewed just as a line on a map. A lot of the National Historic Trails are driving routes because that's what they were originally created for. Even though automobiles weren't created, it was the way that the wagons and horses brought people across to some of the territories and to be able to discover California, Oregon, Santa Fe, all of the trails, Pony Express. Then those were the easiest routes that they had discovered. And so then logically, those were the ones that became the highways. So some of them are literally lines on a map along roadways, but they're also more than just the treadway of the scenic trails and the wagon routes that are still in existence out there. So for National Scenic Trails, when you get into Section 3 in the very beginning of the National Trail System Act, I'm not going to read this all to you, but there's some language that talks about what these trails are for. And there's some specific words about the conservation and enjoyment of these scenic, historic, and natural and cultural qualities. And then when you get into the historic trails, it talks about identifying those same qualities that are up in the National Trail System, or the National Scenic Trails, but also specifically about the protection of these historic routes. And so those words are key, the purpose, once we then get into some of the authorities for land acquisition for the trails. So the Appalachian Trail was the one that actually started out with land acquisition for the trail. Right now, all of the trails operate under willing seller authority. That amendment was put in specifically for willing selling authority in the 1990s. It was Steve Elkington, who was my predecessor in this position, worked with others and got that in there because once the Appalachian Trail was going through their land acquisition program and had actually utilized, which there is authority in the National Trail System Act for condemnation for eminent domain, and that was used on the Appalachian Trail. As more areas were being developed, more concerns about eminent domain from the federal government, there was less backing from Congress and other areas to allow that to happen, and through LWCF. So right now, all of the trails operate under willing seller authority. When the AT did use condemnation authority, the number of times they used it, the majority of those times were for abandoned lands. So properties that were up on ridge lines that had been there for a very long time, some of them since the Civil War. Family members could no longer be found, and we would go to court and use condemnation authority to take those lands. There were, the stories about, in the Cumberland Valley in Pennsylvania and other areas, there were some contentious areas that did get to be part of the Appalachian Trail through condemnation authority, but that's not the whole story. So right now, all of the trails function under willing seller authority. And the one key thing to understand with national trails is because of the routes that they have and the corridors that then are identified for these trails, there's no proclamation boundary for any of these trails. When you have a trail like the North Country National Scenic Trail that spans from South Dakota to New York State, over 4,000 miles long, and trying to identify the corridor for that, it's very hard to stick to a proclamation boundary. So that's something that's key, especially when we're coming up working with some of the partner aspects. There's also authority for transfer of management. So administration of these lands, once acquired, there's authority in the National Trail System Act to transfer the administration of those lands to another federal agency. And that has been used also on the Appalachian National Scenic Trail. Lands acquired in New Hampshire, all of the lands in New Hampshire have been transferred to the White Mountain National Forest. So even though the White Mountain National Forest has a proclamation boundary, because of the authority under the National Trail System Act, they administer the lands outside of their boundary in the state of New Hampshire as part of the White Mountain National Forest. So when we do transfer lands for management under another agency, it does fall under their regulations and policies. So that's just something interesting to keep in mind. We've acquired land that has maybe not been the top priority for a national trail, but it may be jointly a priority from a national trail and an adjoining national park or national forest, so that we can work together to preserve some lands outside of proclamation boundaries and then transfer the management back to that entity. There's also authority for states to acquire lands. And not only is there the Fed side of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, but there's also a state side to it where there's a grant program administered by the National Park Service nationally. And states have to, they apply for the land acquisition similar to how the agencies do it, but they have to have a recreation plan. So it's called a SCORP, a State Comprehensive Outdoor Recreation Plan. And then in that plan, they have to identify what their priorities are for protection and creating more public lands within states and park areas. So national trails can work with the individual states that they traverse and begin to identify, again, just like with the other federal agencies, where's the low-hanging fruit, where we can identify where state lands can benefit from the state side LWCF funds, and it can also be added to protection of a national trail. And then once we begin to acquire all these lands, there's broad authority for management. And so we have authority in the National Trail System Act for cooperative agreements with not only nonprofits and states and education and tribal areas like we have just under the umbrella of the National Park System or other agencies for cooperative agreements. In the National Trail System Act, it actually gives us authority for cooperative agreements with corporations and with individuals. I have never seen it used for those latter two, but it does give us the authority to do that because of the acknowledgement of the breadth of these trails and the need for land protection and how we might be able to do that. And then the use of volunteers they're just the backbone of all of the national trails, historic and scenic, and even the recreation trails. without the volunteer and partner organizations, these trails would not be able to function. So to give you an example of how that is actually applied, and again, going back to the AT is the mothership of the national trails when it comes to land acquisition. The trail is 99.9% complete. At one point, I think there was a celebration a few years ago that it actually was completed with one of the final land acquisition pieces down in Virginia with the Forest Service. But there's still, depending on the corridor and how it needs to be, the trail may need to be rerouted because of, RTE species or erosion of the trail or other things, construction, we can just go on and on about, incursions and other things into the trail. But when it gets to the actual land acquisition on this map that you see here on this slide, the dark green are the federal lands. The red line is the Appalachian National Scenic Trail, and that's the actual treadway. That's the center line that's been GPSed and out there on the maps. From here, it crosses from Virginia down in the very bottom of the map. It crosses into West Virginia and then goes down through Harpers Ferry National Historic Park, the C&O Canal, and then starts heading up the South Mountain Ridge Line. And so Maryland joined in the effort of protecting the Appalachian Trail. They also have a number of state parks in this area, so it was a win-win for them to begin to connect their state parks and to have a thread connecting them, as well as protecting the Appalachian Trail. But you can see the patchwork quilt of lands that's here. So when you're dealing with encroachments, when you're dealing with incidents, if there's anything that happens to a hiker out there, literally, and there was a case, unfortunately, where somebody had committed suicide, and this one was the case that I was thinking of was a little bit south of here in Virginia, very similar land acquisition pattern. We had the National Park Service law enforcement rangers out there. We had the state police from Virginia, state police from West Virginia, and a GIS coordinator out there with a GPS unit trying to identify where this body actually was. It was right on the line, and so whose jurisdiction it is. So it gets very complicated once you get into managing these lands. When you just think of hunting regulations, so the state of Maryland allows hunting on their lands. On Park Service lands, we do not, typically throughout the corridor for the Appalachian National Scenic Trail. So in this area, we had to work with the state of Maryland for them to amend their regulations for the corridor of the trail. So when you think of their plans for their state parks and just within the whole states, there has to be some special planning amendments or considerations given to national trail corridors. When we cross through Forest Service lands, we work with them within their forest management plans to have specific prescriptions and a corridor of management prescriptions for national trails. And that was created by the Appalachian Trail. It's now used by the Continental Divide Trail, as well as the Pacific Crest Trail and others. And that same planning process has been brought to the Bureau of Land Management and any of the other federal agencies and state agencies that the trail crosses to begin to identify corridors within plans within federal lands for national trails. So it's not a simple process by any means, even when you're within federal lands, state lands, or when you're doing joint land acquisition, like on this map that you see here. So then once you acquire the lands, then you have boundary. So again, using the Appalachian Trail at one point, I'm not sure if it's still true, has one of the second largest boundary programs in the National Park Service, more boundary than Yellowstone. So right here at this time, I'm not sure when this slide was created. It was a few years ago. It might be a little bit more, but more than 1,200 miles of maintained boundary line. And that's just outside of state areas and federal areas. These are just the lands that are acquired for the boundary of the Appalachian National Scenic Trail. So to date, they have acquired more than 200,000 acres of lands for the protection of the Appalachian Trail. That was acquired through both the Forest Service and the Park Service. So quite an extensive program. And so just to do the boundary, the Appalachian Trail has all of their boundary in FMSS. So if you're in the Park Service, it's the facility management software system that we put all of our assets in and its condition. So the boundary is a separate asset within FMSS for the Appalachian National Scenic Trail, and some of the other trails that have just begun to acquire their first tract of land are just beginning to think about this process. So for on the AT, the goal that they have on here is to maintain, repaint 100 miles of boundary, and that's just of the boundary. So you can see the boundary marker on this other picture here that I just pulled up. There's also monuments and boundary markers that are nailed to these trees, the boundary trees, and the volunteers go out there, repaint them, look at them, look for encroachments. So yellow blazing, the Appalachian Trail as we call it, volunteers really, some of them just love this, just going through and bushwhacking and finding the boundary and clearing that and keeping it open and being the eyes and ears, as it says on here. The overall program is maintained by the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, which is the lead nonprofit for the Appalachian National Scenic Trail. They have seasonal boundary maintenance staff. I believe that they have 1 or 2 permanent staff just for the boundary program for the Appalachian Trail. So once you start acquiring land, it's not just something that you can walk away from. And the one key thing that we've learned from Don King and others, Don King is the manager of the lands office, the Washington Lands Office up in Martinsburg, West Virginia. And he also, at one point, the Appalachian Trail had their own land acquisition office because of the scale of acquiring lands for the trail. And, it's not just so easy to buy land and walk away. So when you think of buying land, anybody out there, when you're buying land and for a federal purpose, think of the cost and adding that in, not only the cost of the land, but also getting it surveyed and surveyed properly and marked so that then you can maintain it into the future. So getting away from the Appalachian Trail specifically, so onto the National Trail System overall, since 2014, I believe it was begun under America's Great Outdoors. There was a program called the Collaborative Landscape, and it was all of the federal agencies, the land management agencies, got together and they would put out a call and ask for collaborative landscape proposals. And it was in 2015 that Gary Werner, who's the executive director of the Partnership for the National Trail System, got all of the nonprofit partners along the trails and the federal agencies, and the concept of an idea to put out there that the National Trail System on its own is a large landscape. And when you look at this map, I mean, it truly is. It looks like lines on the map, but again, it gets to all of the corridors around these trails and how they could be protected. So together, we submitted a collaborative landscape proposal and was accepted. And so this map that you're seeing here is from 2017. The dots are the specific land tracts that were under consideration for acquisition in that year. And every year, the National Trail System has been awarded LWCF funds for land acquisition. And even in 2018, it's still true. So the collaborative landscape program is currently on hold. We haven't heard whether they're going to be opening that up again, but it has benefited us in the past and put us on the map or gave us some recognition, not only with the National Trail System alone, but as a collaborative landscape. And so from here, what we want to do is just going beyond the collaborative landscape proposal and whether that's going to be offered from the federal agencies or not, the nonprofits want to get together and begin to look at a gap analysis of the whole National Trail System. So the Partnership for the National Trail System is working with the Trust for Public Land, and we're using their resources, their GIS database, their connections, to begin to create a data set of all of the unprotected segments of the national trails. And it's not that, we're going to go out there and begin to just, identify, all of these lands as potential land acquisition. We want to prioritize them and what the opportunities are. And so where are the longest roadwalks? There's some on the North Country Trail where you could be on a roadwalk for 20 miles. Where are the specific access points along those that can benefit maybe state lands and a national trail to create more access to these areas and to help protect the national trail? The high priority sites and segments along national historic trails, those wagon routes that are still out there, and how do we begin to protect them? And when you protect an area that has wagon routes and you're standing on them, and it's just so awe-inspiring knowing that all of these wagons were crossing the country, you don't want those wagon routes in the middle of a developed area or a shopping mall. So of course you also want to be considering the other resource protection around it and the view sheds. And so this gets back to not having a proclamation boundary, but considering the corridor of the trails and protecting the aspects and the scenic values of those trails. And so I spoke a little bit about some of the partnership opportunities that we've had from other federal agencies, from state agencies, with some of the nonprofit partners that we work with directly here, the Partnership for the National Trail System and Trust for Public Land. But we can also think about just the broader opportunities. And so this is a map taken from the Network for the Landscape Conservation and all of the networks that have registered themselves as part of the network. And when you think of these dots, and this is just those areas that have added themselves to the network, when you think of all of the land trusts that are across the country, all of those entities that may not be aware of the National Trail System, our Land Acquisition Authority, and how we could have a win-win situation where somebody in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, and they're managing a 2,000-mile length of trail, they have the other partners engaged in managing those lands. When you have a trail like the North Country Trail, and they're based in Michigan, but they're going to be acquiring land out in South Dakota, well, there might be opportunities for where the trail crosses, or in Wyoming or in Montana for some of the other trails, the Continental Divide, or in Washington and Oregon for the Pacific Crest Trail, where it's outside of proclamation boundaries of public land. So these dots begin to get really significant for partnership opportunities. And I was hoping to have a data layer that I could put this over the National Trails System map where you see here. So with all of these lines, you can just begin to imagine the number of areas that they cross and the opportunities for partnerships. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I put out a lot of information, and we can begin to open it up for some questions and discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Rita.
Sure.
All right. So folks, we, if you want, you can enter in some questions into the questions box, and we're going to go through some of those now. Or also, alternatively, once we go through the entered questions, we'll open up the phone lines. We'll take everyone off mute, and then you can ask questions to Rita that way as well. And my colleague, Cass Hardy, also with Connected Conservation, is going to help me here as well. So I'm going to start on the top of the list, and Cass is going to start from the bottom. There was a comment about a national geologic trail, Rita. Is that also a type of trail?
So in the National Trail System Act, it says that national scenic trails should be significant and potentially follow geologic features. So hence the Appalachian Trail, Pacific Crest Trail, Continental Divide, the Ice Age Trail. There's also the Ice Age Geologic, and I might not have the name right, the Ice Age National Geologic Trail. It is not part of the National Trail System. It was designated outside, and I'm not sure of the constituency behind that or the purpose, but it's not the Ice Age National Scenic Trail.
Okay. We also have a comment here. Will we make the graphic with the map and trail emblems available in a high resolution format?
Yes, and it is. So please go to trails50.org. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. So if you go to trails50.org, that's the website for the 50th anniversary of the National Trail System. And if you go to Resources and Toolkit, under the toolkit, there's the logos for the 50th anniversary. There's the map that you can download. There's videos. All of those are open to use for anybody to promote the National Trail System.
Awesome. Okay, there's another question here about the Ice Age floods. National Geologic Trail, how does that fit in with the trail system? I guess it's a similar comment to earlier.
Yeah, it was a separate designation, standalone. It is not part of the National Trail System.
Okay. Who is in charge of managing each trail? Are there different offices that manage different trails across the country, like similar to a Park Service regional office?
Yeah, so most of the trails have superintendents, just like parks, and they're combined differently. So under the National Trail System Act, trails are administered by a specific department, so the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Interior, and then from there it's been designated down to the agencies. And within the Park Service, trails have a mix of superintendents who are superintendents of their trail, just like a superintendent of a park. Some of the trails are being combined with other park areas, just like some of the smaller parks within the Park Service. You know, just as we deal with you know, our budgets and capacity these days, some areas have one superintendent over several areas. That's the case with some of the trails. In the Intermountain region, Aaron Marr is the superintendent of 9 national historic trails. So he serves as a regional employee. His position is somewhat unique, but he still has the title of superintendent. Within the other agencies, some of them use administrators, that they're the trail administrator of the trail. So the Forest Service and BLM, I believe, uses trail administrators rather than superintendents.
Okay. So it just depends.
Yes.
How's a trail route designated, and what does it take to change or move that route? So
for historic trails, they have to follow what's been determined to be historically significant and identified as the route. So a feasibility study will be done for a scenic trail or a historic trail first, which those can take, you know, as many folks know, for feasibility studies for parks or forests or other areas, can take years, 3 to 5 years. So from Congress to designate that, call for an agency to do the feasibility study, that to be done, a recommendation then going back to Congress and the trail then being designated. So for historic trails, the route has to be nationally significant, and then they have to uphold that significance for the historic route. For scenic trails, there's more flexibility. So for the Appalachian Trail, even prior to the National Trail System Act, when the trail came down through the Appalachians and was coming over the Blue Ridge, the trail actually used the route where Blue Ridge Parkway is. When Blue Ridge Parkway came in, the trail jumped the whole valley and went over to the next ridge line over, and that was the area. Reroutes of national scenic trails typically haven't been that significant since the act was passed, but they do have a lot more opportunity to identify where the scenery for this national scenic trail will be, based on the opportunities of open land, available land, public lands that they could traverse to still keep the scenic integrity of that trail. We call that, and the process that they use for that is the optimal location review, the OLR, we call it. And so when even the North Country Trail today, the significant segments that are on roadways, they can do an OLR and look at either side of that roadway and what the opportunities are, so it doesn't have to stick to a traditional route that was determined through history.
Cool. So what in your view is the biggest challenge facing the trail system?
Protection. So protection of it. And, again, it's not that we have to have, these 58,000 miles protected end to end, but the integrity of the system so that these, especially with the historic trails, that they're not just going to be a line on a map, that there still are the wagon ruts to be found. There was a National Trails Conference in Salt Lake City, and they went out and looked at a segment of one of the National Historic Trails, and it was just ironic that, here you could see some of the wagon ruts coming down this hillside, and there was a huge for sale sign at the bottom. This whole property was for sale. And so, how do we protect these, significant resources and the stories of these trails so that they're not just a story? They're not just going to be part of a book or a story to be told, that people can still go out and visit them.
So here's a related then question is, so what are those tools that the trails need to protect the trails? Surveys and identification, mapping, acquisition, cooperative agreements. What are the main tools?
So it's all of those, and it comes down to partnerships, especially when you have willing sellers. So, the Trust for Public Lands, the Conservation Fund, the Nature Conservancy are the three main national organizations that we work with to protect land, working with local partners who are aware of, lands as they become available, or, just in their conversations, being a neighbor. And it doesn't always mean, buying land in fee and then having to manage the whole thing. It means also the opportunity of acquiring easements, conservation easements. And those easements don't have to be held by the federal government. Some of the national trail partners have land trusts operations as part of their 501c3. They have a separate 501c3 to acquire lands. The Maine Appalachian Trail Club has their own land trust, and they're a manager of the section of the Appalachian Trail in Maine. They work with the Conservation Fund and TPL in identifying lands. They work with the state and working when the state is going to renew its state comprehensive outdoor recreation plan for the whole state to make sure that the national trails are part of that and begin to identify where lands could be acquired by the states for the protection of trails. Working with private landowners and, again, having those easements that don't have to come to the federal government, but can go to other entities. So it's having to be aware and be savvy. It doesn't mean that a trail administrator needs to, be top-notch in land acquisition, but having the partners and an array of partners that are knowledgeable of this and that can help them protect segments of the trails.
Great. So this is changing course a little bit. So besides the 18 Pacific Crest Trail, what are the next several most traveled trails?
The Continental Divide, as far as the Triple Crown of national scenic trails and through hiking, those are the three popular ones. As far as historic trails, there's driving routes along the California, Oregon, Mormon Pioneer, Pony Express. If you're a horseback rider, then in June you're going to want to go out into Kansas and be on the Pony Express Trail and their annual ride. If you're in high school in North Carolina and into biking, there's the annual bike tour of the Trail of Tears, where students from Native American communities want to traverse that route where their predecessors had gone. It really depends on people's interest and the area. I mean, there's even though the AT and PCT and CDT are well known, there may only be segments of the trails that are overly used or have a visitor use management concern where different planning aspects are going to have to be implemented to have permit systems or ridge runners and campsites, designated campsites, all the different management aspects that we use on public lands. There's some areas that are not well known at all. So it comes down to not only the entire trails that are the most known, but even just the segments of those trails that are known and those that are not.
So what is the Park Service's plan for the 50th anniversary?
Wow, so go to trails50.org. We are working, everything is being done. It's also the 50th anniversary for Wild and Scenic Rivers. So probably in that same room, the slide that I had of President Johnson signing the act, that same day, the Wild and Scenic Rivers System Act was signed. And so everything in the Park Service, Forest Service, and BLM is being recognized as the 50th for rivers and trails. And so with that, we do have some separate processes through our partners. We have communications team. There's an interagency communications team that meets monthly. We have our next monthly call tomorrow to talk about some of the press releases, events, and things that are coming up that we want to highlight. There's a whole video. There was a process of videos created that's available on trails50.org. If you go to, I think it's wildandscenicrivers.gov, they have their link to their 50th anniversary info. And from the Park Service, the National Park Foundation is on board. They hope to raise about $1 million this year. They've already come up with more than $500,000. And we've already put out a call for grants and projects, and we hope to continue to do more of that up until, through the rest of this year into next year. The actual anniversary is October 2nd, and we will be having a conference in Vancouver, Washington, October 22nd through the 26th, which is going to be for both Wild and Scenic Rivers and National Trails. So keep an eye out for that.
Great. So how important is it to avoid being on or near motorized vehicle routes?
So the only national scenic trail that has authority for motorized routes is the Continental Divide Trail because of some of the roads that it traverses. So that was grandfathered in. If your purpose is for being more of a, for solitude, for backpacking, then, staying away from motorized use is going to be significant more for safety reasons than anything else. But, in some of those areas where it is combined, then the trail is managed as such, just as you would, for pedestrian use along motorized routes. But typically, from the act, the language, and from practices on the ground, we strive to avoid motorized routes.
Okay. There was a comment here also that we have a partner that holds easements in southern Arizona for a national historic trail as well. So that, so again, I guess that it would be applicable to national scenic trails, national historic trails. Your office is partnering with others.
Yeah, so the land acquisition isn't done through the Washington office. I don't have any involvement with the specific land acquisition other than to assist with processes if there's a collaborative process or something that we can do more on a national level. If something is in Arizona, and it's a historic trail, I would assume it's the Juan Bautista de Anza that they have easements for it to protect, or it could even be part of the Arizona National Scenic Trail. And the Juan Bautista de Anza is administered by the National Park Service. The Arizona National Scenic Trail is administered by the U.S. Forest Service. And so, those easements could be held by an NGO, by a state, by the Forest Service, by the Park Service. It gets complicated, but all of those are options to help protect just one or all of the national trails.
And here's a tough one. Can you speak to ownership and jurisdiction as they relate to federal obligations and responsibility under various regulatory laws, NEPA, NHPA, ESA, especially as it relates to ownership that is not federal? What is our responsibility?
Yeah, so the regulations apply to the lands that they apply to. So if it's federal lands, then federal NEPA laws apply. If we're going to put a shovel in the ground, you need to have all the compliance put in place, no matter where it is. So on that map that you saw of the Appalachian Trail and the pockets of federal land and state land, we've constructed shelters, outhouses, side trails, and we go up there and identify whose land it's on and do the compliance as needed. If it's on state land, then it depends on the state's requirements, and a lot of states have their own NEPA legislation and compliance processes that they have to follow. And so segments of trail that cross state lands have to then be approved by the states. The one thing that we have is that federal monies can be used for construction and management of national trails on state lands. So it gets complicated because there is a federal interest in that. However, typically we've always resorted to follow for the construction of trails to follow the state compliance processes, and then through the authority of being able to use federal funds on state lands, then using cooperative agreements to transfer the funds to a nonprofit entity that will then help us construct the lands through their trail crews or other processes on state lands, or directly to the states. We've also done interagency agreements and service first agreements.
Well, and here's another great question. Are all national scenic and historic trails considered units of the national park system? If not, why is there variability in that classification?
Oh my God, this is born in my. So unit is units are not based in law. They're not even based in policy in the National Park Service. The term unit is something that was created internally more as a budgetary process in the Park Service back in the 80s. And as these new areas are being created, heritage areas, national trails, more of them were coming into the system, that they wanted to have some protection over some budget applications for the national parks. We don't know why. Director Mott, back in the 80s, signed a memo. I have a copy of it. It's only 3 sentences that says that the Appalachian Trail, the Natchez Trace National Scenic Trail, and the Potomac Heritage National Scenic Trail will become units of the national park system. So all of the trails are part of the service. There was a service-wide plan that was just updated. It may not be out in final right now. Even trying to define what a unit is not, there is no definition of what it is. At one point it was that they had to have a base budget, they could own lands, and they had FTE and a superintendent. Well, the majority of national trails, scenic or historic, have all of those. And so it's not cut and dry by any means. There is legislation. Some of the trail partners have worked with their constituencies, that their congressional members up on the Hill, and there's an act out there that's been put forward 2 or 3 times called the Parity Act, where the North Country Trail, Ice Age Trail, and the New England National Scenic Trails, the last 3 of the Park Service National Scenic Trails, that they would be designated units. And it's a conversation going back and forth between Congress. Congress doesn't know why the trails are not units. The Park Service is saying that Congress should have designated them units. Congress says they didn't know they needed to do that specifically. So it gets complicated, and it's not a clear process by any means. But DO 45 is the policy for the National Trail System, and in there it specifically states that trails, regardless of unit status, national trails will be eligible for everything that a national park unit would be. So any fund source, any support that we could get from any of the regional programs or Washington level programs and land acquisition is all available to the National Trails.
Great. Okay. So Rita, if you have a few more minutes, I'm going to open up the lines and take everyone off mute. And we'll see if anyone has any other questions. All right. While I'm doing this, Rita, I guess one other question that I had, do you see momentum behind kind of, I guess, foundations and a lot of this broader conversation around landscape conservation? Do you see more interest in helping to protect these trail corridors by foundations and land trusts and everything? Do you see kind of a growing movement in any way?
Yeah, so the Partnership for the National Trail System, some of the larger land acquisition programs, the National Trails, the Appalachian Trail, Pacific Crest, others, there's been talk of creating a land acquisition fund with the support of outside entities. It's a concept that's being discussed. There is interest from various partners. Some local land trusts specifically. There's discussions being had with larger foundations, so it is definitely something being explored.
All right. Any other questions?
This is Suzanne. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I had a question. So we have a trail within our park that is part of a historic corridor, but it is not a National Historic Trail. So I was wondering what the benefits are of pursuing National Historic Trail designation. If the land is protected, the corridor is protected, but if there's other benefits that we should be thinking about, including just being part of a nationally recognized group of historic trails.
Yeah, so I'm not sure, because some of the trails, the historic trails span, almost the whole country. So when you're talking about Lewis and Clark, so if this is a segment of a historic corridor, the benefit would be to, have a whole trail designated. There would be much more of a larger network. There is the Land Acquisition Authority, the cooperative agreement, the partnership authorities. It would have to go through a feasibility study. That study would come back. There would be a recommendation, whether the study was done from the Forest Service or the Park Service. Recommendation would go forward back to Congress of yay or nay of what that trail, whether it should be designated. And then from there, just like other park areas, it could have a base budget, staff. So not knowing the specifics, you would have to go through the National Trail System Act and see if it's worth that effort. I mean, if right now maybe it doesn't meet nationally significant, maybe it's just state significant, then it may not be worth pursuing going through a 3 to 5 year study. But if so, then you would have to get a member of Congress on board, pass an amendment to the National Trail System Act for a feasibility study, and that would begin the process.
Okay, great, thanks.
Hey, Rita, this is Lori Jenkins. Rita, thanks. Great presentation, but I am still confused about why the Ice Age Flood National Geologic Trail is not part of this trail system. I mean, it's got the same logo. Maybe there's something I can read somewhere, but a little bit more background would be great.
Yeah, I don't know the specifics of that trail. I do know that there was a feasibility study. It did not meet the criteria of a national scenic trail. There is an Ice Age National Scenic Trail in existence already, and so why the geologic trail did not meet the criteria, I would have to go back and find the feasibility study, but there was enough of a constituency behind it, rallied and got it designated as a separate entity outside of the National Trails system. So it is standalone. That's all I can tell you without going back and looking up its own feasibility.
No, that's more than I knew. So it was just not considered nationally significant.
Right, or I'm not sure which criteria it was missing from being designated from the National Trail system. But with an Ice Age trail already in existence, there could have been some confusion, or I would have to go back and look at that study itself.
That's fine, thank you.
Sure.
All right, we have time for one more. All right, one more for me, Rita. The American Discovery Trail. I've heard about it. I think I've seen something on a trail indicating it's there. Is it?
So it does have a major nonprofit behind it. That they have, I don't know if it's clubs or chapters or affiliations across the country, but they do have, pockets in the various states that it traverses. The original study from the Park Service, this was back in the late 80s, early 90s, did suggest that it would meet the criteria of National Scenic Trail. After further study and further consideration from Congress and others, there were more questions that came up of whether that study was actually complete, and that it had some other considerations to it. So it was tabled. It is right now, the trail is, majority of it is on roads, which some of the other scenic trails are too, but this one primarily is on roads, and it's so no, it has not been designated as a national trail. It still comes up for consideration from Congress periodically, and various questions come up from all of the public lands and states that it traverses as to its designation. So it has not been designated as of yet.
And this is for other folks. This is a trail that would go from like California to Maryland or Delaware. So it would go the other directions.
Yeah, and the recommendation, it actually did not meet the criteria of scenic or historic. What the Park Service said was that a new category could be created called a new category of discovery trails. And that was more the holdup of what's the definition of discovery trails, and that has never been flushed out.
All right. Well, thank you, Rita. Awesome presentation, and thanks for everyone for all the great questions. Mark your calendars again for the next 2 months. There's again going to be presentations on trails next month on May 16 at 3 Eastern Time. The Forest Service and the Continental Divide Trail Coalition will be talking about the Continental Divide National Scenic Trail, and then on June 13 at 4 Eastern Time, the Forest Service and Pacific Crest Trail Association will be talking about the Pacific Crest National Scenic Trail. And then also, because it was mentioned, and it's also the anniversary of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, we're going to have Joan Harn with the National Park Service discuss that system as well on July 10 at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. And you can register for all these different webinars now if you go to our Connected Conservation Toolkit, or again, if you go to the Network for Landscape Conservation website. There's links for registering for all those webinars there. So that's it. Thank you so much, and thank you again, Rita, for the great presentation. It's fantastic. This recording will this presentation was recorded, so will be made available again on the toolkit, and then also again on the Network for Landscape Conservation's website. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.